This is a huge honor for me to be back, to be at this, because I started my career in 1984 at Price's Dairies in Aray, New Mexico, flushing cows, and amazing memories, and so it's great to come back and be here. I want to talk about some of the changes that have been going on in human IVF over the last few years. When I got into human IVF, we were carrying pagers around. Women came to the clinic with bags of urine. We smelled like an old bar in the French Quarter in New Orleans, and we would do retrievals at all hours of the night. We transferred embryos on day 2, and they were 4 cells, and the pregnancy rates were around 10 to 12%. But since then, we've had the development of ICSI, which we've heard about earlier. We're doing routine blastocyst culture, vitrification. We've got better sperm selection methods, which we'll talk about, and then also blastocyst biopsy. I want to talk a little bit about just a couple of things here, and that is that really the access of the technology to IVF in the United States is kind of behind with the rest of the world, and that is because most IVF is covered in Europe, and in the States, although 10 to 13% of all childbearing couples have some type of infertility issue, not everybody gets treatment. Reason for that is socioeconomic factors. Surprisingly, the religious beliefs are really becoming bigger and bigger. And then I think the biggest thing, though, is the lack of insurance coverage. The good thing is, though, because people now are accepting that IVF is probably the best way to go, we do see people moving more and more into human IVF or into IVF versus controlled intrauterine stimulations. So I did want to talk a little bit about follicular stimulations, because if I remember from my own bovine days, it seemed like we didn't really tailor the follicular stimulations as much as we do now in the human. And part of the problem that we deal with a lot in human IVF is some of the medical consequences of follicular stimulation. We can develop a syndrome called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which is a lethal syndrome. Women can die from this. So really the goal of what we're trying to do is develop as many follicles as we can, because human embryo development is remarkably low in the human compared to other species. Only about 40 to 50% of embryos become blastocysts, and roughly about half of those will make a decent embryo. So really what we have to do is try to improve the yields, and what can we do? We're using recombinant products now, and this is a big deal because up until not so long ago, we were collecting urine still from postmenopausal women, mostly in monasteries. This was being processed into FSH, LH products. You can well imagine that the FSH to LH ratios were all over the place in these products. So now we're using recombinant. LH is still a urinary product, but it's highly purified. We are adding LH back now in most of the follicular stimulations, and most of us are following step-down protocols based upon how the initial estradiol levels are in response to these gonadotropins, as much as how the follicles begin to develop. So we closely monitor patients for this, and so we have developed a few biomarkers that are used. In fact, I saw one of them out there for commercially available. I had no idea. So we are still using antral follicle counts. This is still measured early on, and this certainly helps us develop the dosage of gonadotropins that we should use. The other thing that we use is day 3 FSH values, with day 0 being the onset of menses. We used to think that this would be a great mechanism, a simple blood test, because obviously the higher the FSH level was, the less number of follicles that were there. But it doesn't really predict on how many eggs you're going to get. It doesn't really help predict on how many eggs you're going to get, like I just said, but also the quality. So probably the most promising, though, is the AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone, because the level of AMH that we're getting from these follicles, which are 2 to 6 millimeter follicles that we pick up on during the luteal phase or early follicular phase, those are the ones that are making the AMH. Most IVF clinics use all 3 of these markers to individualize a follicular stimulation protocol. Some of the important considerations, though, are we do have to remember, though, that embryo quality can be significantly impacted by that. And what I mean by excess oocytes, so there are some, we know that the lead follicles, when they get to be about 17 to 18 millimeters in size, those are our most competent oocytes. Back in the old days when we would collect one at a time, virtually all the babies come from those lead follicles. But what some people would do, were tempted were to grow all of these follicles, even the secondary and tertiary waves up. So follicles were getting up to 24 millimeters in size. And yes, we were getting many more eggs, but the oocyte quality was terrible, and we didn't get very good blastocysts. The other thing we know is that we can have a big impact on the amount of proteins that accumulate in the cytoplasm, which are very important for all aspects of cytoplasmic maturation. But also we have embryos where have altered metabolism, where perhaps they're exposed to too many growth factors in the follicle. And we know that endometrial function and receptivity can be pushed to a certain point where we actually become asynchronous. The interesting thing in the human is we have a really wide window of competence, 8 to 13 days to produce oocytes. What we have found, though, is when we go less than 8 days and when we start going out 14 and 15 days, that the quality of the oocytes that we get are much more lesser desirable. So what about days of stimulation? You can see that the pregnancy rates here at our clinic, as they do vary quite a bit, you can see that the vast majority of patients have anywhere from 9 to 10 to 11 days of stimulation. I did want to bring up a couple of things about nomenclature that we do use in human IVF. People often wonder what the heck is a biochemical pregnancy is. When a patient has a positive pregnancy test, either done at home or the blood level, all we're simply looking for is an elevation in beta-HCG. We just want to see if the patient is pregnant. And the reason for that is that we're providing most of these patients with some type of luteal support, because we really have a very difficult time prospectively knowing which patients have luteal support. So we kind of take a blanket cause and put all patients on luteal support, even after superovulation. But we do that just because we can't figure out which 10 to 15% are going to have a luteal defect. So the other aspect is we look at their clinical pregnancy rates. And here, typically, the patient is out 12, 14 weeks. We have a viable heartbeat. And typically, at this point, the patient is going off to see the referring OBGYN. We're over the majority of miscarriages at this point. So generally, loss rates are usually only about 3 or 4% after about 12 to 14 weeks. So you'll see when you read the literature about human IVF, you'll often see pregnancy rates broken down in various ways just to describe it. And that's a little bit of the background as to why we do it. So the number of oocytes that we retrieve, you can just say as a background that we want to get as many oocytes from that patient as we can. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme as we get into embryo biopsy. So you can assume that we're all going to try to get as many oocytes as we can in a safe manner. So as a result of that, we've come to find out that the number of oocytes that we get is a relatively good indication of ovarian function as well as ovarian competence. So in other words, if we give Mrs. Smith 300 units of FSH and she makes 18 oocytes, but we give Mrs. Jones the same amount and she only gives us 5 oocytes, then that will kind of tell you that the lady with the 20 oocytes probably has better competence than the lady with the 5. So experience has shown that as the number of mature oocytes goes up, then the ongoing pregnancy rates will increase as well. And again, that's because of the inefficiency of this, but also patients as they start to get older, we have much more meiotic issues with these, much more mosaicism in these embryos, complex abnormalities as well. And so here you can see just from this sampling of data from our clinic that when we get less than 5 oocytes or less, that our pregnancy rates are much slower. And you can see, too, that now the pregnancy rates in human IVF have really gone up quite a bit. They're no longer in the 13 and 14% range. You can see that when we have a patient that produces lots of oocytes, typically these are young tubal cases or patients that have, say, a male factor, you're virtually guaranteed you're going to get that patient pregnant on either the first On the fresh transfer, you're going to get her pregnant on the subsequent vitrified replacement. So up to this point, we've really been talking about just follicular stimulation, but also just as important is what are the impacts of sperm quality on outcomes? And this is a big deal because we know that male infertility is probably one of the fastest growing subgroups of infertility in the United States. There's a lot of reasons as to why that's done. It could be because we're aging more. A lot of the pesticides and herbicides and things like that that often get sprayed on food has been thought that perhaps has a high affinity for some of the lipids within the testes. Also, some of these hormones have hormone-like structures and often combine to receptor sites. But regardless of the fact is we have seen that sperm quality is really decreasing a lot throughout the world. One of the problems that we face with this, though, is how do we isolate morphologically normal sperm without damaging them? And the way we do this is we use gradients. So we're using what we used to be old Percol gradients, these isotonic particles, and we're still using a particle, and the interfaces are basically is where we catch the debris. Then in samples that have really good sperm parameters, what we'll do is we'll do a much more simplified process. So here there's centrifugation. The sperm go to the bottom of the tube, and then we're going to harvest the sperm from there and wash it to remove the gradient. Whereas over here what we're going to do is simply either take liquefied sperm or the whole semen sample itself, put it in multiple tubes. We place it underneath media or overlay media, however you want. We place them in the incubator at an angle for at 37 degrees for about an hour and a half, and then we'll harvest the most motile sperm that way. And so these are the two samples methods right now that are mostly being used. So how do we know which one to use? Generally, the worse the sperm sample is, the more likely we are to use gradients, because the gradients are really, really good at capturing the cell debris and also capturing on the non-motile sperm. So the motile sperm will be concentrated at the bottom of the pellet. The thing that's very important, though, is to keep in mind is centrifugation speeds and centrifugation times, because human sperm are easily damaged. You can create DNA damage. Generally, we will use swim-up or swim-out preparations when we have really good samples. Again, typically these are tubal cases or patients that are doing genetic testing, various things like that. The beautiful thing is that both methods have been shown to prove highly motile sperm with intact DNA. So we've been talking about DNA here a little bit in sperm. And so right now, there's a big push right now in human IVF to try to develop some biomarkers in this. And like I said, it's because we've got an increasing number of cases of male factors, but the problem that we have is that when we look at sperm, unless they're severely damaged, it's impossible to look at a spermatozoa and go, that sperm has DNA damage, or that sperm does not have DNA damage. And the other problem is that you could bring a sperm sample into the laboratory with, say, 10 to 20% DNA fragmentation, and if you don't know what you're doing in the laboratory, you can actually induce sperm DNA fragmentation all the way up to 70 to 80%. And it can simply be done by heat shock, cold shock, or excessive centrifugation. It's not very hard to do that. We don't really have any tests, though, in vivo tests for it. We have these several tests that we can talk about. So why is DNA damage so important? We're now starting to see that we have lower fertilization rates. We also have suboptimal embryo development, and we have much higher miscarriage rates. And in human IVF, we have put so much tendency in focusing towards the female that we often forget that making a baby is a team sport, and that you have to have good quality spermatozoa to do it. So there have been some tests developed over the last few years. These are in vitro tests that are using fluorescence microscopy. Typically, you have to have hoods that can exhaust some of these chemicals that are used. These are tests that are hard to do in clinical laboratories. This article has got some great descriptions of it, but you can actually determine the number of sperm that are damaged. The problem is that all the sperm are dead now. So what are you going to do with that case when it comes back? So there's been some pretty clever research projects that are going on out there. And so one of them is using hyaluronic acid as a way to catch sperm. And what I mean by that is that, let's first back up a little bit. We know that hyaluronic acid is a major constituent in the extracellular matrix of the cumulus complex. So at the time of in vivo fertilization, we know that human sperm are caught in this complex, but the only sperm that will stay on the cumulus complex are the mature sperm, because they have receptor sites to bind to the HA, to the hyaluronic acid. And so there's been some products that have been developed where we actually are taking microdrops of hyaluron and putting it in ICSI dishes, these 60 millimeter dishes, creating these 3 microdrops. And then what we do is they're basically dehydrated. We rehydrate them. And so what happens is the sperm with little or no DNA damage have a tendency to bind to these surfaces. So when we go in with an ICSI needle, we can then pluck those out and inject just those sperm. It does add some work to the ICSI process, but we are finding some pretty neat things. So this dish is called Pixie. And so right above these lines right there, if you look through a microscope, you'll see 3 little circles that are freeze-dried. And these are the circles now that have been rehydrated, and then you put media, and you can see where the sperm are all sticking right over in here. There's some occasional ones. And you'll see that they're just head down, and their tails are just beating furiously, so you can come in with an ICSI needle and pluck them out. You move them over to PVP. You immobilize the sperm. We don't inject motile sperm into the egg. And you can see that right here, this egg is about to get injected with a spermatozoa. And we're finding that this technique is actually working really well. So currently, we're doing, using this Pixie for the following patients. Patients that come to us either with a history of poor quality embryos from other laboratories or our lab, or patients also that had low or poor rates of blastocyst development, or when we're doing diagnostics now for all of our male patients, for all the patients, we will test the sperm to see what the incidence hyaluron binding is. And curiously enough, couples that have long histories of unexplained infertility, these guys tend to have really great-looking sperm, but very low hyaluron binding assay index. So we end up having to do ICSI on these cases. And the reason why this is great is because often these couples would do IVF. They would pass all of the testing that we have so that we do not have to do ICSI. And the reason why we don't want to do ICSI on everybody is that, first of all, we're worried about any imprinting issues. But secondly, we know that when we do ICSI, we significantly reduce the rate of blastocyst development in the humans. So we try to not do ICSI if we don't have to. And what we find is with these cases of unexplained infertility, we will have no fertilization the next day. The thing that often they have in common is that there's little or no zone of binding, despite the fact that there are millions and millions of spermatozoa in the sample. So it's very important to understand the history of the patients as well. So just to keep moving along now, let's talk a little bit about embryo culture and developmental aspects. And so really, when you are looking at an IVF lab, and those of us that work in IVF labs, we know that the benchmarks, the most important part of any IVF clinic, is the quality of its culture systems and the ability to select the most embryos. You all work in ET and grow embryos, and yet everybody grows embryos very differently. Everybody has different rates of blastocyst development, and that's what separates you all out from each other. And this is the same thing that we find in human IVF, is that all the clinics do things very differently. But regardless, what we're all really trying hard to do is replacement of uterine stage embryos. When I first got into human IVF, it just blew me away that you could put a 4-cell stage human embryo into the oviduct and get a person pregnant. When I was in Florida working, we had a major hurricane that was about to hit. And we had to transfer everything we had. We transferred zygotes, 2 cells, 4 cells, everything. And I remember we did as many transfers as we could before the hurricane hit because we knew it was going to be a really bad one. And you would be surprised how many people got pregnant, even with pronuclear zygotes transferred to the uterus. But we obviously don't want to do that because we want to be able to grow these embryos out and study the developmental history. We think that embryo development is a comprehensive process. It's not a snapshot. You know, this is something that Barry Bavister pushed for many, many years. We also know now with our vitrification techniques that we can freeze blastocysts much better. Human embryos that are derived from in vivo or in vitro have much lower lipid contents in their cell walls, and therefore their permeability is not so good. And these embryos don't freeze nearly as well when we use slow cooling methodologies. We have to vitrify because we know we can't get all the water out, but we've got to get that water in a state that it's not going to damage the embryos. And obviously, if we're going to have a blastocyst biopsy program, we have to be able to grow blastocysts. So one thing that I often hear about is, you know, what about embryo culture systems, the incubation system? Well, one thing is we don't, just like everyone else, we no longer use somatic cell support. And initially in human IVF, and I don't know how it is in your field, but sometimes marketing companies take on a really sexy idea and they think this is cool. Well, in human IVF, everyone thought you had to use sequential culture media, that you had to have a before activation and after activation. And now we know that when we provide the embryo with everything it needs, we can grow embryos in a one-step method. We've also recently introduced the idea of time-lapse monitoring. And the idea of it sounds really cool, other than they're really expensive incubators. But when you think about it, you go, man, if I can look at the embryo every day and not have to take it out of the incubator, and then I can just kind of turn some knobs and figure out rate of cleavage, time to syngamy, time to 4-cell, did it go from a 1-cell to a 2-cell, 1-cell to a 3-cell? Man, this is going to help me pick out the embryo. But the problem is that the nomenclature in our field is still not set, and time-lapse does not work very well when we do conventionally inseminated IVF because the time that the sperm is penetrating the egg is not fixed like it is obviously with ICSI. And also most IVF clinics have a lot of pushback because there's actually companies that say that if you're going to use our time-lapse system, there's an additional charge for that. So we don't agree with that philosophically, so we don't do that. Most embryo culture systems, or laboratories, I should say, are still using what I would call a static embryo evaluation system. But it's not really static if you think about it. I mean, dynamics of a microdrop system are really important, I think, to understand. And that is because the oil overlay, it doesn't stop CO2 loss. It just simply decreases the rate of diffusion, and that's also based upon how heavy the oil is. So if you use light mineral oil versus heavy mineral oil, light paraffin oil, rate of diffusion is very different for that. And also the amount of oil that you use and everything else. One of the things that we found, for example, was in our lab is if you do not have at least 2 millimeters of oil over the top of a microdrop, over a period of 6 days in embryo culture, the osmolarity of your media starts to go up. So you have evaporation in your microdrops if you do not have a sufficient oil overlay. And we found that it took a minimum of 2 millimeters of oil. We also found that oil takes longer to warm up and cool down, and that the pH can change, and the temperature changes. When we do thermocoupler studies, we find that the microdroplet temperature will drop much faster than the oil around it. But there's this relationship between the two, is that as the drop becomes a sink for cool, the oil will begin to heat it up. So it is a dynamic system. So what about developmental traits for blastocyst development? We stated earlier that we think it's really important that we can evaluate embryos safely, that we can tell the difference between the sibling embryos. And we want to be able to do this in a manner that's quick. And so the way we were able to work out some things in our laboratory over the last several years is we developed some embryo evaluation systems that are based with sticking with very strict timelines. And the other thing that we did is that we feel that embryo scoring is a cumulative event. I alluded to this earlier, but this has been something that's been really important in helping us pick the best embryo. So we use a cumulative scoring system when we score embryos. And it seems pretty straightforward. So what we do is zygotes are evaluated. Obviously, if we inseminate eggs on a Monday evening, we look at them Tuesday morning. So about 24 to 26 hours after we inseminated them on Monday, we want to see how many of these eggs have already either gone early cleavage, or we do not see the disappearance of the pronuclei. In other words, all you see is two polar bodies. So we know they've already undergone syngamy. So we want to see what the incidence of embryos are that have cleaved earlier or have already undergone syngamy. That's a positive indicator. The other thing is we want to see exactly how many embryos are at the 4-cell stage 48 to 50 hours after retrieval. We believe that the embryo clock begins to tick when we do the egg retrieval, not necessarily when we do insemination. So as far as like how we measure how embryos are developing, it's really time 0 for us is the time of the retrieval. So on day 3, 72 to 74 hours post-retrieval, we want to see how many embryos are at the 8 to 10 cell stage that are also compacting. This is really important in human IVF. We have found that the incidence of compaction is a very good prognostic indicator of how many embryos are going to make blastocysts. So if we look at the data, if we see this, we can see that if you were in the 24 to 26 hours after insemination, or you were a 2-cell, you can see that the majority of the blastocysts that are coming from those, but also the majority of our high-quality blastocysts are coming from those. And you can see that this is highly significant. So if you only do one thing, you just look at the eggs that cleave early, that's already going to tell you what's going on. Now, part of the reason why we also do this is we use this as a benchmark to see how good our laboratory is. If we start to go through periods of time in the laboratory where we don't have embryos that are cleaving early, and these are good prognosis patients, then we need to look at our culture system to see if something's kind of gotten out of tune a little bit. Obviously, we all want to try to catch these errors before they get too far. Now, we follow day 2, we also see the same trend in that we see that 71% of our blastocysts came from embryos that were 4 cells. And again, you see, though, again, it's a very low percentage of them that are really becoming high-quality blastocysts. So then the trend also follows on day 3. And again, we see, very perfect here that majority of our blastocysts are coming from these embryos that were 8 to 10 cells that were also compacting. And again, you can see that the numbers are very small here. So thoughts on embryo development as to where we are right now, that the data that we looked at here, it seems to indicate that it is a cumulative event. If we look at our embryos the first 3 days of development, we're going to have a pretty good idea of whether or not we're going to have blastocysts or not. It also is a great way of, like I said earlier, of how good our lab is operating. So the data does suggest that the embryo development is a cumulative process. We also feel that this morphokinetics is super important when we're selecting the most viable embryos. And what I mean by that is if on day 5, if I have 2 beautiful expanded blastocysts, we go back and look at the history of that embryo to select which one of those 2 embryos we're going to pick. We do know now that there's a loose correlation but rate of development and aneuploidy. So we know if an embryo went from a 2-cell in the afternoon of day 1, it's a 4-cell on day 2, an 8 to 10 cell embryo on day 3, that embryo is more likely to be normal than an embryo that was a 2PN the afternoon of day 1, a 2-cell on day 2. Now all of a sudden the next day it's an 8 to 10 cell embryo, and now it's become a blastocyst. Those embryos tend to have higher rates of aneuploidy. So the problems, though, that we still face with this is that we cannot select out with 100% certainty the genetically abnormal embryos. In fact, time-lapse can't really either. It can give you some ideas, but it's not 100%. And it still does not allow us to apply routine single embryo transfer in all age groups. So we still have issues of twinning with older patients because of the transfer of 2 embryos. But we have a new technology now that we hope that will stop that, and that is blastocyst biopsy and PGS. So why is it prime time for this? Well, now we've made enough improvements in human IVF that we can get great blastocyst development, and the quality of the blastocysts that we have is much better. And as I alluded to earlier, The vitrification methodologies that we're using are working really great. So why do we biopsy blastocysts also? Well, we're going to get more nuclei. In the old days when we were just biopsying 8-cell embryos, we only took 1 cell. Now we're routinely taking anywhere between 4 to 8 cells. We're able to eliminate most mosaic embryos by this time, which is something we were not able to do on day 3. We are able to reduce the error rates now down to less than 1, they were closer to 3 to 5% when we were biopsying on day 3. For those of us in the laboratory, we're also going to process less embryos, and we're going to be able to improve outcomes with single embryo transfers, and we're going to transfer in a more optimal situation. There is more and more literature coming out now that pregnancies are much healthier when we freeze the embryos and come back later on in a subsequent cycle and put them back. So there is a trend now in IVF clinics to freeze all embryos in a hyperstimulated uterine state and then come back in a non-hyperstimulated state and transfer 1 embryo at a time. Birth weights are higher. Patients tend to go all the way to full term for delivery, and it just tends to be overall a much healthier pregnancy. So I have just a few slides on how biopsy works. So what we do on day 3, we make a small hole in the zona pellucida, and sometimes the inner cell match will hatch out of that. And if that happens, then we have to make another hole. The reason why we do this, though, is because when we look at them on the morning of day 5, we can see here there's around 4 to 5 cells poking out of there, and then we can come in and take them. So what we do is then we take a pipette, pull on them, so where we can see where the junctions are, and then what we do is we use a laser to cut right in here. And you can see with just about 4 or 5 zaps, we were able to cut these cells off. So this embryo will be put back into culture. You'll allow it to re-expand a little bit before we freeze it. And then this tissue will be placed into a buffer solution, and we will send that off for genetics. The paper that really started all of this was an abstract from Bill Schoolcraft's lab in Colorado. And so what he did is he found that, his pregnancy rates were much, much higher in this group of patients that had failed almost 2.5 times IVF. And his controls were not really controls. These were patients that happened to be going through IVF at the same time. But this was such a great paper, or abstract as his meaning, that a lot of people jumped on it. And so this is data from a lab that we use. It's called Reprogenetics. This is a reference lab that we use for all of our biopsy work. And you can see here that the percentage of normal embryos is higher when you biopsy on day 5, that you're going to have less zygotes that you're growing out, and also that the implantation rates are going to be higher here when you're comparing back to the old day 3 methodologies. And for us, this is the first technology that eliminates the maternal effect on implantation, which is huge considering that our population is aging. And you can see that the pregnancy rates of a 30-year-old and that of a 43 to 45-year-old are very high compared to in the old days when we were biopsying on day 3, that you could see that the pregnancy rates drop. And that was because we were only looking at best maybe 12 chromosomes. We're looking at all of them today. So this is really helping us out a lot. So why are numbers so important? We were part of a project back in 2010 that we basically found that for every year age increases, that euploidy rates decrease by almost 3%. And analysis revealed odds of having one euploid embryo significantly decreases with age, and the odds of having at least one euploid embryo significantly increases with every embryo available for biopsy. So the rate-limiting step for us is the number of embryos. And this is, again, data from Reprogenetics from all of the reference laboratories. That you can see that if you only get 1 to 3 embryos, but from an egg donor, so she's 25, 26, you're virtually 100% sure you're going to have 1 embryo. Whereas if you're 43 years old, you're virtually impossible that you're going to have a good embryo for transfer. So you can see that you only have a 37% chance, Whereas here you can see that as patients start to get older, they require more embryos to get up into a group here where it's worth the financial aspects of going through embryo biopsy. So what are the strategies that a lot of IVF labs are doing today? Well, there's these three. Basically, some clinics just have you go through over and over and over again until you have an embryo that's normal. This is really expensive, obviously, to do, and not everybody can afford. Some clinics will freeze oocytes from several attempts. So they may do 2 or 3 IVF cycles, freeze the oocytes, and then at the last cycle, take out all the oocytes at once, thaw them all, ICSI, grow to day 5. What we do in our clinic is we freeze zygotes, then thaw them all out, culture concurrently to increase the likelihood of having a euploid embryo. And the reason for that is we don't really want to freeze at this stage right here. When you look from a perspective of all the things that have gone on, and now you've got this egg ready for fertilization, there's a lot of things that can go wrong here when you're vitrifying oocytes. So we don't really want to do that. What we would much rather do is let fertilization occur and freeze them when they're zygotes. Zygotes are extremely permeable to cryoprotectants. Even with slow cooling, they have a 95, 98% survival rate. With vitrification, it's virtually 100%. And these embryos, when they grow out, have no effects of the freeze-thaw. So by the time they get to the blastocyst stage, you can't even tell the difference. So again, this illustration from Wasserman's lab shows that if you freeze M2s, this is a very precarious stage to freeze in. It's very easy to depolarize all of this and create some issues. Now, there is value in freezing oocytes, and that's done a lot today. But I think oocytes from women who are advanced maternal age, that's probably the worst thing you can do for them. So what we do is called batching. So the patients will batch a lot of oocytes. And so right here you can see that the pregnancy rates from patients that have gone through lots of IVF, most of these patients have diminished ovarian reserve, multiple failures. You can see that we're able to biopsy a similar number of embryos, and that the percentage of embryos that are normal is pretty much the same. Now, these patients here, these are non-batching patients that are using donor eggs. Typically, a lot of these patients right here may be doing something that's a little bit controversial, maybe doing family balancing, or they have a XY-linked disease, and so we're only transferring embryos of a certain sex. These patients over here, the non-batching patients without the donor eggs, are patients that are a good prognosis, generally only have to go through 1 IVF cycle to get enough embryos in order to be able to do embryo biopsy. But you can see that, in this, and again, this is just some very preliminary data, you can see that this is a promising aspect that can help women of advanced maternal age. This particularly is very, very helpful in women who are in their second marriage, where they walk in at 35 and they go, no, you're not going to have a baby with your own kids. You have to do donor eggs. But they've already got, a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old home. They're like, wait a minute, this is crazy. I'm not going to do donor eggs yet. So there are some options for this. So in conclusion, just wanted to state that, we've seen some great advances in human IVF. Just in my short lifetime, I've seen us go from laparoscopic egg retrievals to now we can do this transvaginally. We have ways of keeping the patients from ovulating, so we're not doing procedures all hours of the night. We've developed some great biomarkers to cut down on the incidence of hyperstimulation syndrome, which was a real issue. In fact, there's patients that until recently, you always had 1 or 2 IVF patients that actually would perish from this. It was so dangerous. Or ovarian torsions, all kinds of complications. We know that the number of mature oocytes has an impact on outcomes. We're also now really starting to put a lot of emphasis on sperm testing, and I'm sure over the next year or 2, we're going to see some really cool things that are going out there. We're starting now to look at magnetic sorting of sperm to see if that'll work. We're working with some Argentinians in those projects. We know that grading embryos should be a cumulative process, but nonetheless, rates of human blastocyst development are really low. And for me, I think the part that I'm most excited about right now is being able to biopsy blastocysts, and it doesn't really matter how old you are. If you have a normal embryo, you have just as good a chance of getting pregnant as your baby sister. So on that note, I'd like to acknowledge all my wonderful lab staff and my partner, Mike Opsel, who without these guys putting up with my OCD-ness and craziness, I wouldn't be here today. And thank you so much.